Hi again. Today we're going to talk about how to put everything together in order to think about your paper. So my desk is a mess. This is a sonnet called Ozymandias that I have printed out with a lot of space in between each of the lines so that I can do grammatical analysis in between them. This is the poem that I'm going to be using as an example for what you will do in your own paper by Terrence Hayes. So that's the plan, is to take this sonnet here, Ozymandias, which incidentally you do need to know because it will form the basis of the beginning of the second part of the class. Okay, so let's get started by reading the poem, and then I think that the best way to understand a sonnet or another tightly packed kind of poem like that is to try to draw it first. Okay, so here we go. Okay, so the poem starts out, I met a traveler from an antique land, and we know that the subject is I. I met a traveler from an antique land. Subject, verb. What kind of verb is met? That's an action verb. If it's an action verb, the next thing I need to do is determine whether or not met is a transitive verb or an intransitive verb. Does it have a noun after it, or does it have a prepositional phrase or an adverb after it? Well, I, subject, met, verb. What did I meet? If I can ask what after the verb, that makes it transitive. My direct object is a traveler. What kind of traveler? If we're telling which one, what kind, how many, that's my prepositional phrase. Okay? And that prepositional phrase further modifies traveler, so it's adjectival. Subject, verb, direct object. So if I'm drawing this, here I am. Let's use this paper for that. Here I am, and we'll label this one narrator. Here is my traveler. Now, when I meet my traveler, there's this modifier from an antique land. So now I got to think about what my traveler might look like, because he's from an antique land. Now, in this context, antique means antiquity, and specifically, if we're talking about the period in which Percy Shelley wrote this poem, the way we understand antiquity is that it will either be Egypt or Greece or maybe Rome. These are sort of the major sites of antiquity, maybe Alexandria, but for the most part, we're talking about these areas around the Mediterranean Sea where we found traces of ancient civilization. So now we have to think about what from an antique land means. What kind of traveler are we talking about? And oftentimes we might imagine what a traveler from the East might look like. And I happen to know from the rest of the poem that, and because of the name Ozymandias, which, by the way, you can look up in exactly the way you will have to do for I Lock You in an American Sonnet, Ozymandias is another name for Ramses II. So that means that our traveler from an antique land is coming from Egypt. Is this traveler from an antique land of that land, right? Like, is this a traveler from the Middle East who has come to wherever the narrator is, presumably England, because that's where the poem was published? Or is our traveler an English guy who just came from an antique land and now the two of them are having a conversation? That's a sort of important but unclear modifier. And we would want to be aware of the fact that that modifier doesn't give us too much information of what kind of traveler we have, and so we have to make some assumptions. Okay, so now, what does our traveler say? Who said? Well, what have we learned about clauses? Who is a subject of a clause, right? And we know it's a subject because it's in subjective case, right? So think back to your who and whom pronoun questions. And also think about the lecture that we had about nouns. And look at how, if this is my subject, okay, and all of this, by the way, is an adjectival clause that modifies traveler. Which traveler am I talking about? I am talking about the traveler who said this quotation. And again here, we're looking forward to what we'll learn in the citation section of the class. But please remember that when we have a subject, a tag for speech, and then the rest of that speech, that means that this is some kind of a noun, right? So this whole thing now is a noun. Well, that's an interesting fact because it means that this entire sonnet, and again, sonnets are only 14 lines long. This is not a very long poem. But this entire sonnet starts with I, subject, met, verb, a traveler, direct object. And then all of the rest of this clause, who said blah, 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 and this adjectival descriptor all modify that traveler, right? And so please notice how small this little beginning is, my subject, verb, and direct object, my tiny little main clause for this sentence, and look at all of this stuff that is in the process of adjectival modification of the word traveler. Now that's a big deal because if you look at the substance of this piece of writing, it sure looks like most of this is about the narrative that the guy said. But grammatically, there's some tension between subject, verb, direct object, all kinds of modification, and the way that the poem is structured. And what that grammar does is to remind you that this is the main idea. This part is what we might consider true, right? All of this, starting with this questionable from an antique land, becomes grammatically not necessary to the meaning of that sentence, I met a traveler, because all of this is a gigantic adjective. Okay? So we know that I can say the girl or the pretty girl, and I can cut out I can just say the girl, and my sentence is going to make sense. I can say the pretty girl played in the park, or I can say the girl played in the park, and that adjective is extraneous. So all of this is grammatically extraneous to the meaning of the independent clause. Hey, guess what? I met a traveler. And yet when you read this, and certainly when you listened to it or paid attention to how to understand this poem, that's not the way you understand it. You understand this as the real meat of the poem. So that tension between the grammar and the way the poem is assembled is super, super important. Or to put it another way, let's just think about this. Subject, verb, that's an action verb, and you can ask what after the verb, so it is a transitive verb that has a direct object. I met a traveler. What kind of a traveler? From an antique land. That's a prepositional phrase that is acting as an adjective. It's not a very descriptive one. So our guy could be, some person who's come from an antique land, from Europe. And I apologize, this is not English people, right? It's Napoleon, so it's French people, but the period's right. Another possibility is that it's actually somebody from the land of Egypt, and this is a person in traditional Egyptian garb, or heck, it could be this lady, right? Like, who knows? Because a traveler from an antique land tells us really nothing about the traveler. But let's just say, for the sake of argument, that it's one of the guys who's accompanying Napoleon who came and told the narrator the story. Okay, so here he is. I like this guy because he looks a little sick from being on the camel. So he is the direct object of the sentence that starts this poem out. Also, he is described as a traveler who said some stuff. So notice it's still the same person. I met a traveler from an antique land who said some stuff. What does he say? Well, he says the rest of the text of the poem. But the point is that he himself is still that same old noun, right? He's still the same noun he was when he was just the traveler himself. When it was just this guy, he was a noun. And when he's a noun who says some things, it's still the same guy. When we have the content of what he says through that tagged speech, it's still the same guy. And so the grammar of the poem itself all hinges on the fact we have a subject whom we don't know who it is, and we have an object about whom we really know almost nothing. All we know is that the person was in Egypt. And then that traveler tells us this story. I'm going to stop there, but I just wanted to give you a sense of what grammar could do for us. And again, we're going to come back to this, so hold on to it. Okay? All right.